In today's session, we are going to dissect the design and the code of a chatbot that allows users to book appointments. Our focus will be on tracking module that allows users to retrieve the tracking link so that they can track their appointments in real time and arrive just in time. Now, before jumping into the design, let's functionally understand the tracking flow and how it is designed from a user's perspective. Okay, so let's look at the couple of scenarios on how we can track the appointment. We will also look at the design on how we have tried to accommodate most of the features that will help the users track the appointment. Now, there are a couple of important inputs which are required for a user to track an appointment. The first being the mobile number, and the second one is the reference ID. Now, these two act as an input that will help us query our SQL database using the WCF services that we are leveraging in order to retrieve a JSON response from a RESTful API. So let's first functionally understand how this works. So let us enter a phone number which should be a valid phone number that the user has used to book an appointment. The second thing is the reference number. Okay, now here we are assuming that the user already has the reference number handy. So in this case, let us enter the reference number, which is a 6-digit ID. Now, if the phone number and the reference number matches against a row in our database using the WCF service, we are going to get back the response. Now you can see that we made some mistake over here. So let us try again and see if we can retrieve the reference ID. So let's try again. So we have the number, and this time we are going to enter a 6-digit that is a bit different from what we had entered. Now if it matches again with our database, it should get us the reference ID. Now in our case, we can see that in fact we have received the tracking information simply because we had the phone number as well as the reference ID handy with us. So it was able to give us the details in terms of the clinic as well as the token and the actual tracking ID. With this, the user is going to be able to track the appointment. Now let's go back, let's go back and try to understand a different way to track an appointment. Now another use case where the user does not remember the reference ID. Now in that case, we have provisioned the users to be able to retrieve the reference ID, because as we mentioned that is the most important input in order to retrieve the tracking details. The phone number, likely that the user is always going to remember the phone number, so we are going to enter the same phone number. Right, now in this case, let us assume that we do not remember the reference ID, and then we have couple of ways in which we can retrieve the reference ID. Right, now from the design perspective, we have ensured that the bot caters to the needs of the users, and in this case, there are a couple of options. We can either retrieve the reference ID by the name or by the WhatsApp code. So let us look at how to retrieve by the name. Now this is the name that the users might have used when they booked an appointment. So we have the phone number and now we have the name. Again, if this two matches against the row in our table, then it is likely to bring back the reference ID. Now this is a little bit different from fetching the entire tracking information. So this is bringing back the tracking ID. Now since we already have the tracking ID, in this case it did fetch the tracking ID, we are going to use the tracking ID again because the prompt is asking us to provide the reference number, and this will again query the database with the phone number and the reference ID to bring back the same information, right? So we know against which clinic the user has booked an appointment. We now have the date, the time, as well as the tracking link. Now before we deep dive into the bot designer, I would like to walk you through the high level flow of how we have designed this tracking module, right? So on the screen you see that we have the tracking flow, and the way we saw it functionally working is that we need the mobile number from the user. We also need the booking reference ID, which is nothing but the tracking info. And in our high level flow, we have a use case where if the booking reference ID is available, we go and try to retrieve the information from one of our tracking details API, right? And the result of this is going to be a JSON response, which will allow us to formulate a response to the user. Now this is the first use case. So let us quickly also look at this API that has been designed using the WCF services. So what you see on my screen is an API hosted on the GoDaddy, and at this point we have a endpoint. Okay, so this is the endpoint that is going to allow the developers to retrieve the information from the database. So we have an endpoint. The endpoint has two inputs, or you can call it as two parameters. So one is the mobile, which is required, and the second parameter is the reference ID, which is a 6-digit ID that we have seen. Now if the mobile number and the reference ID matches, we expect a response. Now the response is a JSON response. A JSON response is typically a key and a value pair that you will receive, and this is very important from the bot designing perspective because this is the output we require in order to formulate our response to the user. So in this case we see that the inputs are valid, and as a result we have a response, and this is the similar response that we have seen on the chatbot, right? So as you can see, we have the API called as get tracking for bot. So let's add that API over here. So this is what we have, and this is going to be your get tracking info from bot, right? So this is going to be your endpoint, and we already saw that we had the mobile number and the tracking ID as the input. So we're going to add the mobile number and the tracking. Right? And this results into a response that is desired by the user. So this is our first use case. The second use case is when the user does not have the reference number handy, right? So we don't have a reference number, and as a result of that, we can either track an appointment by name or by the WhatsApp code. So if we look at the name, this is the positive scenario that we had encountered earlier, and this calls a tracking ID API, which is a little bit different from the information. The purpose of the tracking ID is to provide us with the ID so that this ID can be an input as a part of the reference number, and further that it can query the database using the tracking info API. So let's look at how this API works and what response does it provide to us. So we will go back to our Postman and see if we can get the response. So in this case, we are calling a different API, get tracking information for bot, and this time it is by phone and name, right? So, and this has the phone as an input and the name as an input, right? So now we have an endpoint called as get tracking information, right? So let's copy this. So this get tracking information is the API that is being called as a part of our tracking API, okay? And this API has got two inputs. The first one being the phone. So we're going to have the phone as an input, and the second one is going to be the name as an input. So we're just going to put the name. So name is the distinguishing factor from the get tracking info, and of course the mobile, right? So this two together is going to formulate an input to the bot, right? And we can see that when we send this information to our server, we are likely to receive a valid response, right? Now the API is capable of displaying various different type of information. Let's say that we add a name that might not be a valid, right? So what response did we receive, right? The API provided us with an information that it could not find any appointments, right? Now as a designer, you want to be able to display a friendly text to your users. So this is your friendly text, and we have already seen this when we were trying to functionally understand how this application works. Also, as a designer, you need some attributes or you can call them as friendly or helper attributes that's going to help you identify what action you should take when you receive a valid versus an invalid response, right? So how do you know as a designer that you have received a valid or a invalid response, right? So this is in accordance and with the developers who are actually developing the APIs. We will get the information from them as to what are the helper attributes that we have and how we should be identifying if the response is a valid or not, right? So in this case, we have received a response not found. Now this becomes a flag for us. So once we look into the designer, we will learn more about how do you bifurcate or segregate your flows based on the helper attributes. Now let's say that we have received a response desired by the user. You can see that we have the flag providing us with information that's going to help bifurcate the flow, and this time it's a positive, right? So let's go back to our flow and understand the third use case. The third use case is interesting and a bit complicated. Now in order to make the WhatsApp code work, we need to have a valid WhatsApp business account. In our case, we have that. So what we are doing here is we are going to a separate module, right? Now this is a separate module that is specifically catering to the sending the WhatsApp messages. Now the WhatsApp message that we are trying to send over here is the 4-digit code that is generated from our WCF services, which is sent on the user's WhatsApp API. Remember that we already have the user's mobile number, so it's easy to retrieve this particular number and send the code, right? And once the code is received on the device, on the phone, we are going to use the same tracking ID API, right, to return, right, the same information, which is the valid 6-digit reference ID to the user, and then this reference ID will be used against our API to fetch the information from the database. And as a result, you can see that we are covering all the scenarios to ensure that the user is able to track the appointment without having access to the reference ID. Let us quickly look at the bot builder that we are using in order to build this appointment app. So the bot builder, so this is the bot that we have designed, and mainly this has 3 functionalities. One is to track the appointment, the second being the delete or cancel, and the third one is to book an appointment. Looking at our use case, let us dive into the tracking module and understand the flow. So we have already seen a flow at a high level. Now we might want to deep dive and understand how that high level flow interprets into a actual working bot specifically to tracking the appointments. So now that we understand that we have two major inputs, one is to have the user enter the mobile number, and the second input being the tracking ID or the reference number, right? So with this two information handy, looking at the first use case where the user has the reference ID, once the user enters the reference ID, we are displaying information to the user to kindly be patient while we fetch the information. And as a result of the inputs, now we are going to save the mobile number and the tracking ID or the reference number into the variables, and these variables will then be used to call the API that we have. So let us open the code editor and see. So what we see here is some code that has already been written, and we are trying to call our web service, which is the get tracking for bot, that has two parameters. One is the mobile, right? And we are trying to send the information that we have stored in the variables to the API, and then we are parsing the information that is received as a JSON response, and then we are storing that information into the local variables within the designer. Now once we have access to the information from the API, and once we have stored that information, we can easily create our response. And this response basically is an output of a call that we made to the API, and the users are going to see this response, right? Now there are two conditions over here. One is a valid condition and one seems not a valid condition. So we have the two outcomes of the API. If the information is not found, then the bot will display a message that the information or the tracking information could not be retrieved. And if the information is found, then we would see a response. If we click on the flow, we will realize that this outcome is triggered when the return tracking link is not available, right? So which means that our API is either going to send us a response that we see on the screen when there is a valid input, and let's say that if there is an invalid input, and when you try to query the information from the database, you are receiving not available, right? So if the tracking link value is not available, then we know for sure that there is a problem with either the input or the API, and as a result we have a not found. Now I go back and I try to query information which is present in our database, and we are receiving a valid response. And so that is the trigger, right, which is an outcome for a positive or a negative scenario. I'm going to show you how to test the flow in real time using this IDE. Let's head over to the preview button and test the flow. Our use case is specifically to tracking the appointment, so click on the track appointment, and here you can see in real time all the blocks, those are getting executed. So here we are going to enter the phone number, and let us enter a reference ID which does not match. Okay, now we're going to see in real time how the flow behaves, and here you can see that in real time we can actually debug and triage which block is getting executed based on how we have designed the flow. In this case, we could not fetch the results because we did not enter the correct tracking ID. So let's again try again, right? So you already have a try again button. So this is what we have designed, just in case if the user wants to go back, try again, there's a possibility that the user might have entered the information wrong. So we are providing this option to the user so that they do not have to start the entire process again. Now in this case, we are going to enter the correct information, and we are going to enter the correct reference ID. Yeah, this is the reference ID that we had generated previously. So this should result into a different use case, which is basically a success, and as a result of that we can see the tracking information. Behind the scenes, we have all the operations required in order for the bot to interact with the database. And here in this case, we have the bot. So we have the get tracking for bot. This is basically the endpoint that we are calling, which has couple of parameters, which is the mobile number and the correct appointment booking ID or the reference number. If it matches, it results into the information from the database. Otherwise, it is showing us that the information is not available, right? So this is then translating into an endpoint API, or which is an API, right, where we can see the information. If the information is correct, we see the information on the screen. If we enter the inputs which are not matching the database, we see that it gives us a result set in which it says the information is not available. And if you deep dive into the code, right, so what you see here is a similar template which is showing you various different endpoints. And this endpoints, right, for example, get tracking for bot, this is what we are using, and we have defined two parameters, and then we have the actual method, which is the get tracking information for bot, right? And this is basically the actual method that is interacting with the database to fetch the information and then store the information into a class called as support tracking. And our operations contract would define what type of information that we are trying to return to our client. In this case, it is a JSON response. Before we move to the next module, let us recap what we have learned so far. So we looked at the tracking module, and we also looked at the at a very high level the design of the chatbot. We were able to understand how to design and build modules within the chatbot. We specifically looked at a use case where we were requesting the users to provide their mobile number and their reference ID to track the information. We also provided users with various different options to track the information. We also had users use their mobile number as well as the name in order to track the information. At a very high level, we also looked at the high level design of how the WhatsApp code will work in order to provide an enhanced user experience to the users. Let's talk a little bit more about the chatbot designer. So we had a quick glimpse of the chatbot platform and saw its ability to modularize the flow, and should be one of the most important functionalities in any chatbot development platform to build enterprise-wide chatbots. Using our chatbot designer, we were able to experience how the tracking flow was designed and how this functionality was further broken into multiple modules. And this makes our flow more manageable and also makes it easy to understand. We saw the real-time execution of our chatbot flow. We were able to design, run and test our flows within the development environment and test various use cases to ensure that our flow meets the user's requirements. The best way to build and provide great user experience is to be able to incrementally run and test flows to build great experiences. We also learned that as a chatbot developer, we need to consume external services. And in order to accomplish our tasks, we are using the WCF services. Windows Control Foundation is a technology provided by Microsoft as a part of the .NET framework for building distributed systems. It also allows us to create and consume services that can be accessed across different platforms and technologies. We then experienced testing our endpoints using the Postman tool. Now, Postman is a powerful tool for both developers and chatbot designers who work with APIs. It provides a user-friendly interface for creating and sending HTTP requests, as well as a range of features for debugging, testing, and automating API-related tasks. And in order to tie everything together, we are using the Visual Studio Code as our integrated development environment in order to build this WCF services. And we also had a quick glimpse of defining the services and the operations. Those are exposed as a endpoint to the chatbot developer. If you are serious about learning the chatbot development, I suggest that you connect with me via the chat on my website, which is QuickBots, which is hosted on the UTeach platform, and provide me with your requirements. I generally run these courses one-on-one or maybe in a group of 4 to 5 people, where you will have access to some of the advanced chatbot development platforms available in the market. You'll also have access to the SQL Server backend. You'll be able to design the tables, the stored procedures, and the functions. We are going to learn this together. Plus, you'll also have a place to host your web service if you're interested to do the backend development. There are also other courses that I'm offering on this site, specifically on the ASP.NET Core MVC. This is also a course that will help you to build enterprise grade applications, web applications, as well as the web services. So you can visit my website and have a look at the courses that I'm offering, and you're also welcome to join my community at community.quickbots.com, where we have like-minded individuals who have already enrolled for the courses, specifically on the chatbot. There's a lot of materials in terms of the documentation that we have in order to get you started building chatbots. You'll also find some interesting examples or use cases where you'll be able to follow the instructions in order to create bots. For example, we have an out of office API reference, and if you are not a front end developer, you'll still be able to use the front end applications that we have built in order to ensure that you are able to build chatbots that interact with your front end in order to build great experiences. So if you are interested in learning building the chatbots through both the mediums, which is through the self-guided modules as well as the one-on-ones, feel free to chat with me on my website, and let's have a conversation. Thank you for watching this course. See you soon.